Researchers have uncovered what's believed to be Jesus' tomb inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
What if a forgotten town buried under centuries of mud held a secret that could reshape one of Christianity's oldest debates?
We've been uncovering amazing remains of a Byzantine church complex. The church covers an area of about 1.5 dunams.
Near the shores of the Sea of Galilee, a team of archaeologists has uncovered a 1,500-year-old church. And inside it, a mosaic with a message so precise, so theologically loaded, it's raising eyebrows across the world. In northern Israel, just a short distance from the Sea of Galilee, a team of archaeologists has been uncovering the remains of what appears to be a large Byzantine church complex. This site, which spans around 1.5 dunams, roughly 1,500 square meters, has attracted considerable attention, not only for its scale, but for what was found inside. The discovery centers on a mosaic floor, remarkably well preserved despite being buried beneath centuries of mud, debris, and seasonal flooding. This mosaic contains an ancient Greek inscription, only a few lines long. Yet it has the potential to reshape how scholars and theologians understand the early Christian world. The inscription refers directly to Peter, one of the 12 apostles mentioned in the New Testament, not just as a follower of Jesus, but with a specific title: Chief of the Apostles, and holder of the keys of the kingdom of heaven. The language is strikingly similar to a passage found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verse 19, in which Jesus says to Peter, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." That phrase has been interpreted in many ways over the centuries, often forming the basis for discussions about Peter's role and authority within the early church. What makes this inscription particularly interesting is where it was found and who likely created it. The church lies close to the shore of the Sea of Galilee, in a region historically linked to Bethsaida, a town mentioned multiple times in the New Testament. Bethsaida is known as the hometown of Peter, along with his brother Andrew and another disciple, Philip. The Gospel of John, for example, explicitly says that Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. For many years, however, the exact location of Bethsaida has been uncertain. Archaeologists and biblical scholars have proposed various sites, but no single location had offered definitive proof, until now, possibly. The church's location, combined with the specific language of the mosaic, is leading some experts to reconsider long-held assumptions. To understand the context, it's important to recognize that mosaics in Byzantine churches were not simply decorative. They often included inscriptions that served as dedications, theological declarations, or prayers for the community or for individual patrons. In this case, the mosaic includes a prayer mentioning someone named Constantine, not the Roman emperor, but likely a local figure who contributed to the construction or renovation of the church. The prayer asks for intercession from Peter, referring to him in elevated, almost official terms. While references to Peter are not uncommon in early Christian art and texts, this specific phrasing, Chief of the Apostles and holder of the keys, stands out. It suggests that the community who built this church held a particular view of Peter's role in the early church, possibly one that emphasized his leadership and authority above the other apostles. The mosaic is also notable for its condition. Despite being over 1,400 years old, it remains in a state that archaeologists have described as almost pristine. The lines of Greek text are clear, the stonework is intact, and the message has survived with minimal damage. Such preservation is rare, especially in a region that has experienced centuries of natural erosion, conflict, and shifting populations. The site itself was first brought to public attention by a team led by Professor Mordecai Aviam of Kinneret College and Dr. Stephen Notley of Nyack College. They began work at the site known as El Araj, with the aim of investigating its potential connection to the biblical town of Bethsaida. Their excavations uncovered layers of settlement from both the Roman and Byzantine periods, including residential buildings, pottery, coins, and eventually the church structure. The church was likely built during the Byzantine period, sometime between the 5th and 6th centuries CE. That was a time when Christian pilgrimage was becoming increasingly common, and churches were often constructed on sites believed to have direct links to figures from the New Testament. In this context, building a church to honor Peter near his supposed hometown would have made perfect sense for the early Christian community. While the inscription does not definitively prove that this was Peter's actual hometown, it does provide compelling evidence that early Christians believed it was. And belief in this case has archaeological consequences. People in the Byzantine period didn't choose random spots for churches of this importance. They relied on local tradition, oral histories, and early Christian memory to guide where they built places of worship and pilgrimage. Experts in biblical archaeology and theology have begun weighing in on the significance of the find. Dr. Craig Evans, a well-known scholar on the historical Jesus, has commented that this may be the most direct physical link to Peter's life ever discovered. Meanwhile, Dr. Notley, co-director of the excavation, has said that the mosaic and the church itself are starting to confirm not just the geography of Bethsaida, but also some of the theological ideas that developed very early in Christian history. Of course, the discovery raises questions. What exactly did early Christians believe about Peter? How widespread was the view that he held a unique position among the apostles? And why is this perspective encoded so clearly in a church located far from Rome in Greek and long before the division of the church into Eastern and Western traditions? Some argue that the discovery supports the idea that Peter's leadership was recognized broadly across early Christian communities, not just by those in the Western or Latin-speaking church. The fact that the inscription is written in Greek, still the dominant language of the Eastern Mediterranean at the time, points to the idea that this belief in Peter's special role was not limited to Rome or later Catholic theology. Instead, it may have been a part of early Christian identity more generally. This interpretation doesn't settle centuries of theological debate. It doesn't confirm or deny doctrines about papal authority, nor does it resolve the complex history of the Church's development. But it does offer something that is often missing in such discussions: physical evidence. A mosaic laid by human hands, using common building materials, but carrying a message that has survived against all odds. For those who study the early church, that kind of evidence is rare and valuable. It adds a new dimension to our understanding of how Christian beliefs were practiced, communicated, and remembered in the centuries following the New Testament period. It also bridges the gap between texts and lived experience, giving us a glimpse into what mattered most to a specific group of believers in a specific time and place. In that sense, the discovery is not just about Peter or even about Bethsaida. It's about how history and faith intersect, how stories are preserved across generations, and how archaeology can occasionally uncover more than artifacts. It can uncover memory. This mosaic is more than just a piece of art. It's a message from the past, reminding us that the questions we ask today are often rooted in conversations that began long ago. For many centuries, the precise location of Bethsaida, the town known from the New Testament as the hometown of three of Jesus' apostles, Peter, Andrew, and Philip, has remained one of the most elusive puzzles in biblical archaeology. Although the Gospels refer to it multiple times, identifying where it once stood has proven much more difficult. This mystery has left scholars, theologians, and archaeologists debating for well over 100 years, each proposing different locations with varying degrees of evidence. Bethsaida is mentioned in several places in the New Testament. In John 1:44, the writer tells us plainly that Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. It's also a site associated with several of Jesus' miracles. The Gospel of Mark recounts that it was near Bethsaida where Jesus healed a blind man. The Gospel of Luke mentions the feeding of the 5,000, which also took place near this town. Yet despite these important references, the town's physical location faded from view. Over time, it essentially disappeared from history. One of the more unusual aspects of Bethsaida's story is that Jesus is also said to have criticized the town harshly. In the Gospel of Matthew, he is quoted as saying, "Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles performed in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago." After that rebuke, Bethsaida effectively vanishes from the biblical narrative. Later historical records do little to clarify where it was or what became of it. By the Middle Ages, Bethsaida's location was uncertain. Christian pilgrims traveling through the Holy Land during that period relied mostly on oral traditions and devotional writings, but none of those accounts provided clear or consistent information. What remained were only scattered clues. occasional references in the writings of early travelers, mentions in church documents, and local legends. It wasn't until modern archaeological methods developed that researchers could begin to take a more systematic approach. In the 19th century, several Western expeditions to the Holy Land began trying to identify biblical sites with more precision. German and American researchers proposed a site known as Et Tel, located roughly 2 kilometers inland from the northeastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, as a possible candidate for ancient Bethsaida. This proposal gained traction for a time. It appeared to have ancient ruins and was close enough to the area where the events of the Gospels are believed to have taken place. However, problems quickly emerged with the Et Tel theory. For a town that was supposedly home to fishermen, its distance from the lake seemed questionable. A fishing village located that far inland raised practical concerns. How would fishermen have easily accessed the water? Moreover, although there were ancient remains at the site, many of them appeared to date from later periods, and there was a notable absence of first-century Roman material, the period during which Jesus and the apostles would have lived. Then came a turning point in 1967, following the Six-Day War. With the region now more accessible to researchers, Israeli archaeologists began new surveys of areas closer to the Sea of Galilee. These efforts eventually led to increased interest in another site, El Araj. Located in a lower, marshy area right near the northern edge of the lake, El Araj was not initially considered a strong candidate. The area had been difficult to excavate due to seasonal flooding and thick layers of mud. Despite these challenges, new findings began to emerge. Initial surface surveys revealed fragments of pottery and glass that hinted at a long history of occupation. These included both Roman and Byzantine materials, an important detail because it suggested that the site had been continuously inhabited over a long period, including during the time of Jesus and the early church. A major boost in attention came in the early 2000s. Pope John Paul II, while visiting Israel, flew over the region and was greeted by a local archaeological team. As a symbolic gesture, he was presented with a replica of an ancient bronze key discovered near the site, a key that some believed symbolized Peter's spiritual authority, as described in the Gospel of Matthew. This event helped bring El Araj further into the spotlight. But it was in 2016 that real momentum began to build. That year, a formal archaeological dig was launched at El Araj, backed by institutions including the University of Nebraska at Omaha and Kinneret College in Israel. The excavation was led by Professor Mordecai Aviam and Dr. Stephen Notley, who aimed to determine whether this site might in fact be the true location of Bethsaida. In just the first season of excavation, the team uncovered striking evidence of Roman-era presence. They found coins, tools, and pottery dating back to the 1st century CE, the exact period when Jesus and the apostles would have lived. These discoveries were important because they confirmed that El Araj had been an active settlement at the time. This was something Et Tel had not convincingly demonstrated. Over the next few years, the findings became even more compelling. In 2018, the excavation revealed the foundations of a large Byzantine basilica, a church structure from the 5th or 6th century CE. The layout suggested a significant religious complex, complete with a bathhouse, guest rooms, and communal spaces. These elements matched what one might expect from a church built on a site of pilgrimage, a place visited by early Christians who believed it was connected to the apostles. Then came the discovery of the mosaics. The church floor contained several Greek inscriptions, 2 of which were fragmented, but one was remarkably well preserved. This inscription named a man called Constantine, likely a local patron, and included a direct prayer to St. Peter. It referred to Peter as chief of the apostles and holder of the keys to the heavenly kingdom. The wording was direct, the tone reverent, and the theological implications substantial. This mosaic seemed to echo a centuries-old account by a Bavarian bishop named Willibald, who traveled through the Holy Land in the year 725 AD. In his writings, he described spending the night in a church in Bethsaida that was dedicated to Peter and Andrew. For years, Willibald's account had been treated with skepticism by modern scholars, who saw it as part of the colorful but unreliable literature of medieval pilgrimage. But now, the church he described may have been located. The structure, the dedication, and the geographic details all seem to align with what Willibald had recorded. Suddenly, a story that had long been dismissed as pious legend was being re-examined in light of physical evidence. The possibility that this site was the actual location of biblical Bethsaida gained weight. Archaeologists found that the church was not just a standalone building but part of a broader complex, complete with infrastructure that would support pilgrims visiting a site of religious importance. The layout and location of El Araj made it an increasingly convincing candidate. Its proximity to the Sea of Galilee made sense for a fishing village. Its Roman era remains confirmed activity during the time of the apostles. And its Byzantine church, with inscriptions honoring Peter, matched both the historical context and early Christian memory. Altogether, these discoveries marked a shift in the academic consensus. While some still support Et Tel as a possibility, many researchers now view El Araj as the more likely location for ancient Bethsaida. The debate is not entirely settled, but the evidence from El Araj continues to grow, and with it, the case for a once-forgotten village that played a central role in the story of the early church. Among the many artifacts uncovered at the El Araj site, none has sparked more conversation or carried more potential significance than a single Greek inscription discovered on the mosaic floor of the Byzantine church. Although mosaics are a common feature in church structures from this period, this particular inscription stands out, not just for its clarity and preservation, but for the specific message it conveys. The mosaic, framed in a delicate geometric pattern made of tiny stone tiles, includes a short but powerful text written in Koine Greek, the everyday language of much of the Eastern Roman Empire. It mentions a man named Constantine, likely a local patron who funded the creation of the church floor. The inscription also includes a request for the Apostle Peter to intercede for Constantine and his children. What has drawn so much attention is the way Peter is described. He is referred to with two distinct titles: Chief of the Apostles and Holder of the Keys of the Heavenly Kingdom. At first glance, these phrases may seem like respectful religious language, but for those familiar with Christian history and theology, these titles carry deep meaning. The wording directly echoes a well-known passage from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verse 19. In that passage, Jesus says to Peter, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." This moment is one of the most frequently cited verses in discussions about Peter's role in the early church. The reference to keys is not just a metaphor. In ancient times, keys symbolized authority, responsibility, and delegated power. They were often held by royal stewards or trusted officials who managed access to places and possessions on behalf of a ruler. In the Hebrew Bible, the prophet Isaiah describes a figure named Eliakim, who is given the key to the house of David, saying, "What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open." This idea of keys being passed on as a symbol of stewardship connects directly to how early Christians may have understood Jesus' words to Peter. The phrase "Chief of the Apostles" also carries strong implications. While all 12 apostles played important roles in the early church, calling Peter the chief among them suggests a level of leadership and authority that goes beyond being a member of a group. It implies a central role, one that was acknowledged and respected within the community that built the church at El Araj. What makes this inscription especially interesting is that it was found in Galilee, far from Rome, and written in Greek, not Latin. This suggests that the belief in Peter's leadership was not limited to the Roman Church or the Western tradition. Instead, it appears to have been present and recognized in the Eastern Christian world as well, even centuries before the formal division between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. The church at El Araj was likely constructed in the 5th or 6th century CE, during the Byzantine period. This was a time when Christian communities across the empire were consolidating their sacred geography, marking and memorializing locations associated with the life of Jesus and the apostles. Churches were often built on sites believed to be linked to key biblical events or figures. This practice wasn't random. It was based on oral tradition, community memory, and the desire to preserve and honor the roots of the Christian faith. In this context, the choice to build a church at El Araj and to dedicate it so specifically to Peter indicates that the people of the time believed this place had a real connection to the apostle. The mosaic inscription supports that idea, both by naming Peter and by using language that reflects an established theological understanding of his role. The clarity and condition of the mosaic add to its importance. After lying buried for over 1,400 years, the inscription is still legible, with its letters and patterns well preserved. This level of preservation is unusual and allows modern researchers to study the language, craftsmanship, and religious beliefs of the community that created it with a level of detail that is rarely possible. While the mosaic doesn't prove with absolute certainty that this was Peter's actual home, it does show that early Christians believed it was. More importantly, it reveals how they thought about Peter, not only as a disciple of Jesus, but as someone with a unique role and authority. These beliefs were strong enough to be literally set in stone. This is where archaeology meets theology in a very tangible way. Texts from the Bible and early Christian writers have long shaped our understanding of Peter and the apostles. But physical evidence like this mosaic helps confirm that those ideas weren't just confined to written documents. They were part of the lived religious culture of real communities in the early centuries of Christianity. The mosaic also aligns closely with the account of Willibald, the 8th century Bavarian bishop, who wrote about visiting a church dedicated to Peter and Andrew in a town believed to be Bethsaida. He described staying overnight at the church and noted that it was located near the Sea of Galilee. For many years, his description was treated with suspicion by scholars who viewed medieval travel narratives as unreliable. But now, with the discovery of the church, its layout, and especially this mosaic, Willibald's account is being taken more seriously. All of this points to a pattern, a specific location associated with a particular biblical figure, preserved through time by both physical structures and written memory. It suggests that the early Christian community at El Araj wasn't just honoring Peter in a general sense. They were acknowledging a specific role they believed he held, and they saw the place itself as part of that legacy. The implications are significant. The use of the phrase "holder of the keys" connects directly to later theological discussions about Peter's authority and eventually the idea of apostolic succession. While this discovery doesn't settle all the debates that have taken place over the centuries, especially between different Christian denominations, it does show that the view of Peter as a central leading figure existed long before those debates took shape. It also challenges the idea that beliefs about Peter's primacy were invented later by the Roman Church. Instead, the mosaic suggests that this understanding was already present in the wider Christian world during the early Byzantine period. This was a time when the Church was still united, before the East-West Schism of 1054, which formally divided Christianity into the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions. The language used in the inscription, clear, respectful, and theologically specific, reflects the values and beliefs of the community that created it. It also serves as a reminder that archaeological discoveries are not just about objects or structures. They are about people, what they believed, how they lived, and what they wanted future generations to remember. For modern viewers and researchers, the mosaic at El Araj offers a unique glimpse into how early Christians in Galilee understood the legacy of Peter. It provides evidence that their belief in his authority was not just rooted in Scripture, but was a lived reality, expressed through worship, art, and architecture. Discovering the ruins of an ancient church is a major archaeological event in itself. But uncovering a church that appears to have been built directly over a first-century fishing village mentioned in the Gospels and dedicated to one of Christianity's most central figures takes on an entirely different level of importance. The site at El Araj, now strongly believed by many scholars to be the lost town of Bethsaida, may not only solve a long-standing geographic mystery, but it also opens the door to a deeper conversation about early Christian beliefs, memory, and how sacred tradition was preserved and passed on over time. What makes this discovery stand out is not just the evidence of an ancient church, but the clear connection it makes between a biblical location, historical figures, and a theological claim. The mosaic inscription found within the church doesn't simply honor Peter as a disciple. It describes him with language that implies spiritual authority and leadership. Phrases like chief of the apostles and holder of the keys of the heavenly kingdom. These are not casual titles. They speak to a defined understanding of Peter's role in the Christian movement and suggest that this understanding was already in place centuries before the divisions between different branches of Christianity emerged. When early Christians chose locations for their churches, they did so with intention. In the 5th and 6th centuries, believers were not working with modern maps or archaeological methods. What they relied on was collective memory, oral tradition, and a kind of spiritual geography, a sense of where certain events took place based on the stories that had been passed down through generations. This was a time when pilgrimage was becoming increasingly central to Christian life. Pilgrims wanted to walk where Jesus had walked, to see the towns where the apostles had lived, and to worship in places tied to their faith. Across the Holy Land, this can be seen in how churches were placed. In Bethlehem, the Church of the Nativity marks the traditional site of Jesus' birth. In Nazareth, the Church of the Annunciation stands over the location believed to be where the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary. In Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built over what was understood to be the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. These locations may not have been chosen through scientific validation, but they were selected based on a continuity of memory that communities held with deep conviction. The same principle likely guided the construction of the church at El Araj. The builders may not have had historical records as we do today, but they had something else: a closeness in time and tradition to the events they were commemorating. The memories of where things happened, of who lived where, and of what those places meant had not yet been buried by centuries of displacement or political change. That makes the church at El Araj more than just a structure. It's a kind of time capsule, preserving what early Christians believed and remembered about their own sacred history. The archaeological evidence supports this idea of continuity. Beneath the church are remains of first-century life: fishing tools, pottery, coins, and household items. These remnants suggest that this was indeed a working village during the time of Jesus and his followers. If this was Bethsaida, as many now believe, then it would have been home to real people whose names appear in the Gospels. People who heard Jesus teach, who witnessed miracles, and who left their lives to follow him. And then, centuries later, their village became a place of worship. A church was constructed not just anywhere, but directly over the place where those lives had been lived. It was not a random act of devotion, but an act of memory, a decision to mark the location as sacred because of what had taken place there. This is the pattern seen throughout the early Christian world: sacred sites preserved through community memory, then honored with architecture, art, and ritual. The mosaic inscription at El Araj makes that connection even more concrete. By describing Peter as the chief of the apostles and the one holding the keys to heaven, the inscription tells us not just what the early church believed about him, but also what they believed about the site itself. This was not a symbolic dedication. It was a declaration of significance. The people who built that church did so because they believed they were standing on ground that had been part of the gospel story. This raises important questions for both religious and secular audiences. What does it mean when belief and history align in this way? How do we interpret evidence that supports long-held traditions, especially when those traditions have been debated or doubted over time? And what does it say about the early church that such a strong theological message was preserved not in Rome, but in a small village in Galilee? The discovery also has implications for understanding how authority was viewed in the early Christian world. The idea that Peter held a unique position among the apostles is central to many interpretations of church leadership, especially within Roman Catholicism. Critics have often argued that this concept developed later, shaped by the growing power of the papacy. But the mosaic at El Araj suggests otherwise. It points to a belief that was already present in the Eastern Church, written in Greek, and far removed from the political structures of Rome. This does not mean that the modern papacy, with all its complexities, is directly confirmed by the find. The archaeological evidence does not make claims about later institutional developments or about how authority should be structured today. But it does show that the idea of Peter as a leader among the apostles was not a late invention. It was a view held by early Christians across different regions, languages, and cultures. And it was important enough to them that they recorded it in stone. This kind of continuity matters. It challenges assumptions about how beliefs evolve and where they come from. It reminds us that tradition is not always separate from evidence, that sometimes the stories handed down through centuries are grounded in real places, real people, and real practices. And it invites us to look more carefully at how memory is preserved, not just in texts, but in architecture, in community, and in the very soil of the places where faith was first lived. For non-Catholics, this discovery does not necessarily change doctrine, but it may offer an opportunity for reflection. The mosaic does not demand agreement, but it does prompt a deeper look into the early church's beliefs and how they were expressed across the Christian world. It asks whether such widespread and early recognition of Peter's role can be dismissed as a later development, or whether it should be taken seriously as part of the original Christian memory. Ultimately, what began as a routine excavation has turned into a significant moment for both archaeology and theology. The church at El Araj, the mosaic inscription, and the ruins of the village below offer a rare convergence of scripture, history, and tradition. They do not provide all the answers, but they offer a compelling piece of the puzzle, a reminder that the past still speaks, and sometimes more clearly than we expect. As the excavation continues, more discoveries may follow. But even now, the message is clear. The early Christian world was not just built on faith, but also on memory. And in places like El Araj, that memory was preserved not just in words but in stone.